31 to order. I will look to the minister for any remarks he wishes to make before getting started.
No, over there.
All right. Okay. Shall clause member from or on clause 1, Peace River South.
Peace River South. Thank you, Chair, Madam Chair. I do want to, before I do start, I just would like to make a little statement as far as, again, respect for the minister and his staff as far as being forthcoming and being willing to share and brief, and I do appreciate that. I did spend a fair amount of time on the bill itself, and at first glance, as I mentioned in the House, it appeared to me to be something that, with some amendments, that I could support. As I thought about it further and as I dug into it further, and we've already discussed, the minister and I have already discussed through the chair, some of the fundamental disagreements that we might have, and I'll be quite frank, a disagreement over the need for this line. And part of the line of questioning is going to be to establish the rationale behind it and also to provide some information that we can spend some time looking at as far as estimates are concerned. So my first question through the chair to the minister is that in its integrated resource plan application to the BC Utility Commission, BC Hydro has forecast an energy deficit position by fiscal 2029 and more seriously, a capacity gap by 2032. Is the minister able to confirm that if shared ownership agreements, as per clause 1 of the transmission line, or of a transmission line anticipated to be completed no earlier than 2037, how will clauses be incorporated to mitigate in the agreements to mitigate these concerns? Was that too convoluted?
Well, give it a go.
Minister.
I'm not sure. I think the last part was to connect the first question, which was, the member is quite right, an estimates question, to section 1 of the bill, and I admire that effort. And what I would say to the member is I'm not going to be too restrictive about that, but the section 1 is quite specific to the issue of co-ownership with First Nations, which is an essential element of the North Coast Transmission Line project. I'd like, just for members of the committee to know, I'm here with Peter Picorni, who's the Deputy Minister of Energy and Climate Solutions, Chris Gilmore, who's the Assistant Deputy Minister, Electricity and Utilities Regulation, Keith Anderson, who's the Senior Vice President, BC Hydro. That's Keith. And Zach Murlovich, the Director of Electricity Policy. So they'll be joining and assisting me with the discussion today. Phase 1 of the project is expected to be ready, if that's the question, by 2030. Phase 2 by 2032. The project will have shovels in the ground next year. With respect to energy demand questions, which I think was his question, I don't think it's really linked to section 1, but I'll just say he'll know because he's been briefed on this, I think, in some detail, that overall, especially industrial demand, and overall energy demand has been flat for some time in British Columbia. And there is, of course, more information coming as we file our integrated resources plan, as BC Hydro does with the BC Utilities Commission. But I think it's fair to say that all of the estimates show demand for power increasing in British Columbia. And to a degree, this bill is a reflection of that. Remember, we'll also know that late last year, we announced the results of a call for power that the BC Utilities Commission, which reviews that call for power in its role, has or is reviewing the electricity purchase agreements that have been made between call for power proponents, successful call for power proponents, and BC Hydro. And we've now engaged as of May in a second call for power The first call for power cumulatively is power the equivalent of Site C, about 500,000 homes, 8% increase in the power available by BC Hydro. The second call for power is expected to be the same. The member asked about capacity. He'll know because I believe he's been briefed on this. And we'll take a break and have a vote and come back because I'll leave you on the edge of your seat with that answer.
Thank you, Minister. We will recess until after the division. on Bill 18, and we had left off the minister, so I will let the minister finish his remarks.
Thank you, Honourable Chair. So I think when we went to the other House for the vote, I was talking about the RFEOI process, which the member has been, of course, briefed on. It was launched on June 4th. The response was received September 8, 2025. Received over 100 submissions from 73 respondents representing nearly 19 gigawatts of potential capacity. I think he asked about capacity. Now, I would say that we're on Section 1 of the bill, and just leave a sense perhaps of the frame that we have Section 1 of the bill for the House. The section is intended and does add new definitions pertaining to the North Coast Transmission Line, ownership agreements for the Hydro and Power Authority Act. The purpose of the section is to establish the authority of the Lieutenant Governor and Council to designate agreements between BC Hydro and First Nations for the shared ownership as part of the NCTL infrastructure, and allow BC Hydro to maintain all its current rights, responsibilities, powers, and immunities under the Hydropower Authority Act, as well as its responsibilities when acting within the terms of the designated agreements. That's the intent of it. Its significance, of course, is very important. The NCTL is a partnership. It will be a partnership between First Nations on the route and BC Hydro, which is, I think, a hugely advantageous consideration for the region, for the First Nations, for BC Hydro, for the project, for the speed with which the project will take place, which we see as important. And we'll be having that discussion because that's what the section's about. It's about enabling that project, NCTL, to go forward.
Member from Priest River South.
Thank you, Chair. And through the Chair to the Minister, absolutely understand with respect to why these questions are coming through Clause 1 is it's not clear to me what's involved in those agreements or what could potentially be involved in the agreements. So that's what I'm trying to flesh out here. I would suggest that I'm also curious through my analysis over the potential for the ownership agreements or the shared ownership agreements in the same integrated resource plan that I referenced earlier. There is a figure labeled 4-5, and it indicates an excess of power, of generating capacity. Sorry, not power, but generating capacity in the Northwest. And I have read an analysis by an independent party that would suggest it's an excess amount of generating capacity. And even given the forecast that Hydro itself used in that figure, I would ask if my question would be, the parties who are going to be signatories under Clause 1, will they be aware of that potential disparity? And then secondly, actually I'll leave it there and then I'll ask the next part so that I don't convolute it.
Minister.
Well, I appreciate the member's suggestion. He's talking about refers to some independent estimate which he didn't identify. Perhaps the member could just identify that would be of assistance.
Member from Priest River South.
Thank you, Minister. Actually, sorry, it was referring to the BC Hydro Integrated Resource Plan application to the BC Utilities Commission. Then it was referencing their 2030, or sorry, it was referencing the 2023 data. And within that document, within that application, I was referencing figure 4-5. And to me, I've looked at it and I've looked at it and I've had an individual that's very knowledgeable in the area review it with me to make sure I was understanding it correctly. And what it is suggesting is that there is an excess amount of generating capacity in the Northwest. So perhaps my concern is that First Nations partnerships that would be signing on under Clause 1, would they be aware of that, and would they be in agreement with the need for the line, given that there currently is an excess amount of generating capacity?
Minister.
Well, I just say to the member that in 2023, BC Hydro undertook an analysis and sought responses to the need for for electricity in the region. And it's all been part of the previous briefing, so the member will know. It's directly relevant to this, but the member will know that that was significant in mining, but not just in mining, but in the Port of Prince Rupert, in LNG, in other developments in the Northwest, that we would need more electricity in the Northwest. And so once that survey was completed, and the conclusion was that we needed more transmission to the Northwest, the government proceeded with NCTL. At that time, it also engaged with First Nations, which that engagement started in 2023, as I noted in the House, and as the member will know from our briefings on this subject, they've been in place, and term sheets have been offered since then. Obviously, First Nations are well aware, because they live in the Northwest, of the enormous economic possibility. I could, if we like, we can go down the list of mining opportunities that are going forward and could go forward based on the assurance that electricity will be coming, and that's why we're building the North Coast Transmission Line. It is a generational opportunity for the Northwest. So in 2023, that review was taken. The results of it have been well known for some time. They were the subject of our estimates debate in the spring. And the decision to proceed, I think, for the government in any event, was an obvious one. A huge generational opportunity to create wealth in the Northwest, jobs for people in the Northwest, jobs for First Nations in the Northwest, and an opportunity that we strongly believe First Nations should share in through a partnership agreement. We've been working with them, and we'll continue to work with them in Phase 1 and Phase 2 for partnership agreements, and those are obviously the first that we do, because those are the first parts of the line that would be built, and subsequently the third phase of the line, in order to ensure that First Nations were part of those transmission opportunities. But we are confident. And if you were to wait for final investment decisions from mine to proceed, then we would be delaying those projects, just as you would if you proceeded, say, with the opposition's position of small nuclear reactors. You'd be waiting decades, and capital would leave. And so our understanding, our work has demonstrated the need for more electricity, clean electricity in the Northwest, and that's why we're proceeding with the line. And certainly, First Nations are not just in agreement with that, but well aware of it.
Member from Priest River South.
Thank you for the answer, Minister. Through the chair, following up on the last answer, will there be, and again with respect to Clause 1, the ownership agreements, we haven't established what those are going to look like with respect to the transmission line, but the minister references a number of mines and opportunities that would proceed. Will there be any ownership agreement or encouragement from those, through the chair, sorry, encouragement for those entities to engage in an ownership agreement with a similar ownership agreement as would be represented in Clause 1?
Minister.
Well, the member will be aware of all the work that's going on with the Tahltan Nation around mining in the Northwest, which is a generational, inspiring opportunity. If he knows, and I know he does because he visited the Northwest this summer, he'll know of the real sense of engagement by First Nations in the region to advance their wealth, their economic circumstances, to create jobs, to become part of it. So if you're talking about, if the question is, are those who will receive the electricity involved with First Nations, you bet they are. But involved with First Nations, Solisms is a project initiated by the Nisga'a First Nation, for example, right? The mining issues are being worked out with the Tahltan and others, depending on where FPX is slightly differently placed than, say, Galore Creek or whatever in terms of the mining. But you bet those projects will be engaged with First Nations, as was LNG Canada, as obviously Cedar LNG, which is another project in the Northwest, which is an extraordinary project, will be effectively the lowest emission LNG in the world until Solisms comes in line. It might be slightly behind Solicitums in that category. So not only are First Nations involved in discussions around mining, discussions around the Port of Prince Rupert, discussions around other economic issues, but they're in fact leading those, as the member knows. So it wouldn't be correct to say that other projects are asking First Nations to be involved when they're being led by First Nations in those cases. But I think it's fair to say that in the region there is enormous interest in economic activity and the creation of support and wealth and community and jobs by First Nations. They've been leaders in this regard, and they've been fully engaged and involved, as they were with CGL, as a member will remember, and involved in his own region in a different way through Treaty 8 and all the discussions about revenue sharing and and restoration, the work done in his region, which is something that is beyond the scope of the bill, but is inspiring, I think, to everybody involved in it.
Member from Peace River South.
Through the chair, thank you to the minister for the detailed answer. What I was getting at was more along the lines of, as we move toward the allocation component of this bill, or the potential allocation component, is there going to be preference given to organizations or groups that have signed an ownership agreement similar to what's represented by Clause 1?
Minister.
Well, we'll get to the allocation framework when we get to Section 2, if that's okay. But I would say in a general sense, you saw in our call for power, again, something that was dealt with in our legislation this spring that we had some occasion to discuss in that case. BC Hydro, part of the criteria for the call for power was a minimum of 25% participation by First Nations in that call for power. And in fact, that was exceeded in every case of an awarded contract. So that was part of the conditions. But this is not really an allocation framework. What this allows is for BC Hydro to become involved in a partnership with First Nations, a joint venture with First Nations, that BC Hydro continues to be responsible for, and we'll get it. I'm sure the member will be asking me about the details of that and responsibility for the system and everything, or his colleague will be. But that's what this section deals with. It allows BC Hydro to do what, for example, the wind companies would have done in that case, which is to have a joint venture partner who's a First Nation.
Member from Peace River South.
Thank you to the minister through the chair. I think I'll move slightly into a different area, and this one is can the minister specify or list which First Nations have been formally consulted and whether these agreements will be tabled for public review? Thank you.
Minister.
So it is not just an issue of consultation, as the member will know, it's an issue of negotiation and discussion of a partnership, right? In terms of Phase 1 nations, which is the phase from Prince George roughly to Fraser Lake, just to put that context where that is, the Clic-Clic-Tenay, the Sulks, the Nazco, the Nidli-Wut-Utan, in Phase 2, the Witsit First Nations, the Silkesco First Nation, the Netibun First Indian Band, the Skintai First Nation, the Wet'suwet'en House Groups, of which, remember, we'll know there are several, the Kitsillas First Nations, the Kitsum-Kalem First Nation, the Metlakatla First Nation, and the Lax-Kw'alaams First Nation, right? So that's in Phase 1 and 2. There will be, of course, as we go into Phase 3, and those negotiations are obviously not underway yet. We're obviously working through it where we're starting construction first, but the first phase of the line, those are the First Nations that are involved. And the process is a subject of negotiation, and when final agreements are announced, we'll be announcing those publicly.
Member from Peace River South.
Thank you to the minister through the chair. So if I heard correctly, well, and I'll actually just ask this as a question as opposed to indicating what I believe that I heard. Have all First Nations whose territories are being crossed, have they been contacted? Have any of them refused to engage in negotiations?
Minister.
Yes.
Member from Peace River South.
Thank you for the very succinct answer, Minister.
I hate to please.
Excellent, excellent. With respect to the agreements, I was looking for a definitive answer in your previous less succinct answer, and perhaps I'll reiterate. Will those agreements be tabled publicly?
Minister.
Oh, there will be commercially sensitive information, and that wouldn't be made public, but substantially, this is a public project of significant note, and aside from anything commercially sensitive, once agreements are made, it'll be made public and they'll be duly celebrated.
Member from Peace River South.
So just to be crystal clear, we're saying that a redacted version of each and every agreement with First Nations will be provided publicly.
Minister.
Well, the substance of the agreements will be made public because it's a public process. Will be made public, not least of which by the First Nations themselves, who will be seeking support and endorsement through their governance structure for the agreements. So the substantial information about the agreement will be made public, even if we don't. Commercially sensitive parts of the agreement aren't made public.
Member from Peace River South.
With respect to the agreements that are subject of Clause 1, would the minister be able to give us an understanding of what, well, my first question would be an understanding of what type of level of ownership that these agreements would, or range of ownership that these agreements would encompass? Thank you.
Minister.
Well, just in a general sense, just to describe what the agreements are, and this may be a less succinct answer just to start us off here. These agreements will include the roles and responsibilities of both BC Hydro and the First Nations partners, including the operational nature of BC Hydro's role in the construction and operation of the line, in the terms of BC Hydro leasing the line from the limited partnership being 50 and up to 50% owned by First Nations. That will be decided, and 50% owned by BC Hydro. Agreements can only be between phases 1, 2, and 3 or 3 First Nations and BC Hydro for co-ownership of the line. Those are the nations. And agreements can only be about construction, operation, control, use, management, maintenance, safeguarding, repair, or upgrade of the North Coast transmission line.
Member from Peace River South.
Thank you, Chair. So to the minister through the chair, I didn't hear potential co-ownership of existing infrastructure. Would that be included in any type of agreement that would be relevant to Clause 1?
Minister.
No.
Member from Peace River South.
Thank you, Chair. Okay, I think that that did answer that. I'm going to move into a slightly different direction at this point. Will the agreements that will be signed under Clause 1, will they assist in any way in opening retail access to industrial customers?
Minister.
No, it doesn't allow retail access, and that's a specific term. Just say that well, the purpose of the agreements is to build the line, and that will allow for connection by industrial customers, whether it be at a distance connection to the main line or or if they're closer to that. But that's allowed, but it's not retail access, no.
Member from Peace River South.
So to clarify, there will be no negotiated agreements within anything applicable to Clause 1 that would allow a carve-out for one of the nations to implement a retail power sale, would be my question. Thank you.
Minister.
No, thank you, Honourable Chair. No, that's not the intention.
Member from
Thank
Peace
you.
River South.
Is there, through the minister, through the chair, is there any language that would be included in those agreements that would prohibit such actions?
Minister.
I laid out what the agreements do include in my previous answer, so the answer to that is no, they don't include that discussion.
Member from Peace River South.
Through the chair to the minister, would there be anything in the agreements that would prohibit infrastructure from being, in the future, being disposed of by one or more of the partners of what's being covered by Clause 1 without either, I'll leave it at that. Would there be anything in the clause or in the agreements that are covered under this clause that would prohibit one of the partners to dispose of any asset that is related to the agreements that would be signed under Clause 1?
Minister.
I think the only thing that would be allowed is nations would be able to sell to other nations along the line, their interest, if you follow me, or to BC Hydro. But other than that, no.
Member from Peace River South.
The language to safeguard BC Hydro ratepayers, would that be included to substantiate the minister's last comment? Would that language be included in the agreements that are under Clause 1?
Minister.
I just note that the agreements, of course, are still under negotiation, but other than what I said, which is that people won't be able to sell except to other First Nations part of the agreement or to BC Hydro, which is a significant limitation. That would be the only provision by which someone could sell that asset.
Member from Peace River South.
Thank you, Chair. Perhaps I'll clarify. I wasn't actually referring to the asset in that question. I was referring to power itself. So would there be an opportunity for a nation to engage in retail sale of power, or is there language specifically prohibiting that in the agreements under Clause 1?
Minister.
Yeah, no.
Member from Peace River South.
Well, you're so succinct, I'm just going to keep my my jacket tied up. Yeah, exactly.
It's good for training.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, cardio. We've already answered that one. Yeah, okay, I'll leave that one alone. Would any agreement signed as part of Clause 1 or under the umbrella of Clause 1, would that represent any customers, commercial customers, that would be asking for 150 megawatts or more? Thank you.
Minister.
Thank you. The new line is to serve all customers, including those with 150 megawatts or more.
Member from Peace River South.
Thank you to the minister through the chair. That being the case, is it then the responsibility of the customer to be an investor in upgrades to meet transmission and generation demand? And if so, do we have, to this point, private investment secured? And if that is the case, would we be able to have that number?
industrial customers won't own the line. They may have to make interconnection. For example, there's a project, even at Bob Quinn Lake, there's some projects that are significant projects, and they have to make their final investment decisions, of course, but there's significant interest, as indicated in 2023 and subsequent to that, from customers who are in the queue. This is obviously their presence in the queue and listing the queue is something that's commercially confidential to them until obviously they are lined up and they make their own decisions about in that respect. So an industrial customer that needed to connect to the North Coast transmission line would be responsible for that, of course. But it doesn't require ownership in the line to do that. They're a customer, and they would be a customer of BC Hydro, just like the member of myself.
Member from Peace River South.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you for that answer. So again, to make it absolutely crystal clear, there can only be, under the agreements of Clause 1, there can only be two owners or two groups of owners, and that being BC Hydro and prescribed First Nations.
Minister.
Yes.
Member from Peace River South.
Thank you for that. And I believe we did cover allocation, which I do agree. Next section is probably a better place to cover that. Will there be, well, that's an allocation question as well. Is there any, through agreements that would be signed under Clause 1, would there be any rationale or explanation as to why the Utility Commission is not involved in those agreements or not being consulted on them?
Minister.
Well, in this case, I think the member would agree with this, there's a demonstrated need, and we can go through that very significant need if the member wishes. We've demonstrated need, and therefore, I think the member is asking about the certificate of public convenience, but I'm not sure. You may want to clarify that, which is not beyond that. But other than that, we've demonstrated need in our proceeding. The activities of BC Hydro, including things such like the Integrated Resources Plan, are subject to review by BCUC all the time. BCUC has a responsibility to BC Hydro customers, whether they be industrial, commercial, or residential, right? But in terms of this project, there was demonstrated need in 2023, and we're proceeding with the project in partnership with First Nations, which is the subject of the amendments to the Hydro and Power Authority Act in Section 1.
Member from Peace River South.
Thank you to the Minister. Again, a point of clarity on my part, and I apologize if I didn't understand this correctly. Did the Minister state that there was no need to subject this project to BCUC because the need was demonstrated in 2023? Did I hear that correctly?
Minister.
So the only way you do that is through CPCN, which is an issue of need for the project. And the government and BC Hydro has already established that need of the project, and that's why, separate from the legislation, there's an exemption from the CPCN, which the member has been briefed on and knows about. But in a general sense, BCUC has oversight of BC Hydro, but doesn't make investment decisions of this sort. They review BC Hydro's plans and their rate applications and other issues, but they wouldn't be dealing with this normally, except in the case for projects over $250 million for CPCN, which in this case has been established separately. The need for the project's been established separately. The government's proceeding in partnership with First Nations, which is the subject of Section 1 of this bill.
Member from Peace River South.
Thank you, Chair. And to follow up to that, and I'll come back to it when it comes back up here. Under Clause 1, will the calculation of the offset and the terms of financial security be the same relative to agreements signed under Clause 1 as all other industrial customers? Thank you.
Minister.
So just to be clear, Section 1 deals with the agreement between First Nations who own the transmission line and BC Hydro to build the NCTL. It's not an agreement with industrial customers. I appreciate that, and it's not a, it's not necessary. These things are not necessarily self-evident, so I'm critical of the question, but that's the case in this case.
Member from Peace River South.
Thank you, Chair. And I will state on the record the minister was correct, and that should have been in a different section. My apologies. My next question is can the minister provide a list of any agreements or memoranda of understanding that have already been negotiated as part of this agreement process under Clause 1? Thank you.
Minister.
Well, term sheets have been negotiated with Phase 2 nations and Phase 2 nations. The rest of the agreements are under discussion, but we're optimistic both in terms of Phase 1 and all the Phase 2 nations that we'll come to agreement, but that's for the negotiation process.
Member from Peace River South.
Thank you for that answer, Minister. I believe that this already was answered, but I would like to ask it in a very clear, concise way, because this is something that stakeholders have questioned me on. Can the minister guarantee unequivocally that public ownership of BC Hydro's core transmission assets will be maintained in full under this bill and any agreement signed thereunder?
Minister.
Well, just to be clear on this point, and the member and some of his colleagues raised it at the second reading debate, what Section 1 does and what the bill does effectively is enable co-ownership with First Nations. This is not privatization. I understand the rhetorical debate, but it's not privatization. BC Hydro remains the operator of the North Coast transmission line, and the rest of BC Hydro grid. For it to be otherwise would not make sense given the integrated nature of the grid. Co-ownership with First Nations is about equity, participation, not about transferring control. The bill enables designated agreements where First Nations can hold ownership interests, but BC Hydro retains its authority to operate, maintain, and manage the line. This is about ensuring support for the development of the line with added benefits, such as speeding up consultation times on permitting and regulatory work, which can translate into project cost savings. And it's something not just BC Hydro does as a commercial crown, but virtually every oil and gas company operating in the members' riding does that he's well aware of. First Nations will be able to earn returns on their equity investment over the life of the project, and this is a stable, long-term economic benefit, not just to First Nations, but I'd argue the entire region. So that's what it does, and that's the role of BC Hydro and the role of the partnership agreement in the construction of the North Coast transmission line.
Member from Peace River South.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for that answer, Minister. So just so that I'm very, very clear, what I believe I heard was that under no circumstances would any agreement under Clause 1, signed under the auspices of Clause 1, affect anything other than the ownership of that transmission line.
Minister.
That's right. That's 3 words.
Again,
Member
I
from
should have
Peace-
left it done up.
Member from Peace River South.
Oh, thank you, Chair. Sorry for speaking too soon. I'm going to get back into a little bit more technical stuff. As I was going through reading and understanding how these agreements might affect different components of pricing, ownership, et cetera, I did do some research on long-run marginal cost. And the question being, are parties affected by Clause 1, the agreements that we're talking about, have they been made aware of significant scaling differences indicated in, well, I should have given preference on our previous reference to this, but I'm referring here to the BC Hydro 24-25 annual report, and specifically figure 6-4. And my question is, have participants in the agreements who are affected by Clause 1, have they been made aware of significant scaling differences indicated in reference figure, comparing in part onshore wind and natural gas generation? And have they had any comment on those differences?
Minister.
Honourable Speaker, this is a transmission project, not a generation project, although I would say that you're talking about, I would say quite reasonably, I look at Mr. Anderson, thousands of hours of work together on the details of this project by First Nations that are thoughtful and sophisticated in this area, who've done an outstanding job representing their interests. And so details, including very significant details about the line itself and where it's located, are dealt with. But this is a transmission project, not a generation project. So no, I mean, I think that First Nations are well aware, and member will know they're very much involved in some of those areas. But this is about a needed transmission project, which, like other transmission projects in recent BC Hydro history, which has served other regions, principally Metro Vancouver, is needed in this region because of demand for power for the aspirations, the economic and social aspirations of the region.
Member from Peace River South.
Thank you, Chair. With respect to, the Minister did mention this, and I am aware that BC Hydro will retain operating rights or operating ability for the transmission line. Would anything that would be signed under the representation of Clause 1 as these nations would be equity partners in the line? My question would be that BC Hydro's annual reports do provide the cost of energy as not fully allocated. Would that financial information be provided to the equity partners as not fully allocated, or would it be provided as fully allocated? As I'm learning to understand the difference between those two, I do understand that there's a significant difference.
Minister.
Well, the role of cost recovery is obviously people paying for electricity, I think is what the so I'd say no. This is a transmission line, again, a transmission line project, North Coast Transmission Line. So obviously the partners will work together to oversee the construction of the line. BC Hydro will operate the line. And issues around BC Hydro's broader system are all publicly known in a general sense, but not specifically relevant to this agreement.
Member from Peace River South.
Thank you. Through the chair, if as a person that does own businesses, I would be very curious. Having an equity share in a piece of structure, I would be very curious as to understanding the revenue or the Obviously, hydro, the partnership is going to be charging, there's a value in that line of the electricity, the electrons moving through that line. How is that value? I guess I'll restate my question. How is the value of that electricity determined, and how is it apportioned as per the agreements in clause 1? Is that done through a fully allocated, a non-allocated calculation, or a fully allocated calculation? Thank you.
Minister.
They're not responsible for the use, so we understand on the transmission line and earning a rate of return on that transmission line, right? But the electricity that goes through the line is often generated by BC Hydro or BC Hydro under contract with another provider and so on. So that's not, this is about the transmission line and the rate of return. I think the member is talking about something else when he talks about allocated and non-allocated.
Member from Peace River South.
Through the chair, I appreciate that my questions perhaps could be more clear. There's the rate of return for an equity investor. How is that calculated?
Minister.
To the member, the asset cost depreciated over time. And hydro, the joint venture partners, receive a rate of return based on those costs and the rate of return with that. That's the way it works. It's not based on the allocation. I think what the member's getting at, but I'll let him decide what he's getting at, is somehow if the line isn't successful, do they get less or something, or if the customers don't get through, do they get less? We're assuming, and I think looking at the numbers, a reasonable person would assume that the line will be full, but regardless, they recover costs from BC Hydro ratepayers based on a rate of return on the investment of the line.
Member from Peace River South.
Thank you, Chair. I will admit that I don't know that I actually have ever seen a contract with my own eyes that would represent the flow of electrons through a power line. So this might be an issue on my end. But as an investor, I remain somewhat confused as far as how, if I was deciding, and I realize that is not part of this bill, I don't have that opportunity, but if I were a representative of a First Nation that was deciding to invest, how would I be able to calculate, or if I was representing a First Nation, how would I be able to calculate what that return is and whether that's a fair value or not?
Minister.
As the member will know, and I don't think this is actually unusual, it's based on the capital cost of the line, right? And essentially their return on equity, which is laid out in the agreement. If BC Hydro owned both ends of the line, it wouldn't necessarily be substantially different than that. And so they're sharing in the return on equity of the line, of course, and that's how the agreement for a transmission line would go, as it would in other energy systems that are differently organized.
Member.
I apologize for belaboring this point. I remain confused. If I was asked to, again, represent someone that was looking at, was being requested to invest $50 million, $20 million, whatever that number is, I fail to understand how I can take pen to paper and understand if I'm getting a fair return. So perhaps it's a lack of understanding on my part. I'll try to rephrase and do this in several parts. How is the utility, how is the power line equity investor paid? What mechanism pays them?
Minister.
Well, BC Hydro pays the joint venture partners through lease payments based on their level of equity and the rate of return agreed to.
Member.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome to the, sorry if I didn't welcome you on the last question. That's beginning to make sense. Again, with respect to how, in my mind, would be, and again, thinking back to someone that would be advising a signatory to Clause 1, to an agreement under Clause 1, would be how would I understand if those lease payments are fair? That my client should either cut the check or they shouldn't.
Minister.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good to see you, Honourable Chair, because they know the rate of return.
Member.
Thank you. So to the Minister, would the rate of return, how is that established? Is that an arbitrary number? Is that's really the crux of what I'm trying to get to, is how, I don't understand where that rate of return would come from. I don't know what that lease payment would be based on, and I don't know how to ascertain whether it would be a fair number or not. Thank you.
Minister.
Well, the reason to be interested in is that transmission lines are very safe investments. And we know we have a sense, and the rate of return is based on Fortis's regulated rate of return through the BC Utilities process, which is notionally 9.65, right? It's based on that regulated rate of return, and obviously the end payment to them is that differential with the cost of borrowing. So it is a good deal, it's a secure deal, it's a safe deal, and it's based on a Fortis, which is a regulated utility in BC, a private one, and their rate of return on their assets.
Member.
Thank you, Minister, through the chair. So if I'm understanding this correctly, this is a guaranteed rate of return with no opportunity for ups or downs throughout the lifespan of the agreement? Thank you.
Minister.
Yeah, it's a stable and safe investment, a good investment for First Nations. There are other, and will be in the agreements, other risk trade-offs. For example, there will be benefits for early completion of the project, which is obviously beneficial to both sides. And so there will be other risk trade-offs. But this is, as you would expect, a transmission line to be a stable and safe investment for First Nations and effectively for BC Hydro.
Member.
Thank you, through the chair, to the minister. That answer does make sense. Again, if I were advising a client who happened to be a signatory or potential signatory to this agreement, I would be, or an agreement that would be subject to Clause 1, I would be very curious as to, is this, so are we saying that this is we've established this as a guaranteed rate over what time frame? Is it the life of the project, or sorry, the life of the agreement? And if so, what is that lifetime? Is there any limits on that lifespan?
Minister.
It's generally, in this case, over the life of the asset, which in this case is 50 years. If there's, for example, opportunities for reinvestment or further expansion, then there may be other opportunities along the line. But in this case, it's a 50-year expected lifespan for the line.
Member.
Thank you, Chair. To the minister, we're talking 50-year lifespan, which, again, I don't know. I'm assuming that's reasonable. What I would ask is that language included explicitly in these agreements?
Minister.
Thank you, Honourable Chair. Yes.
Member.
Thank you, Chair. Again, keeping in this same line of thought, we talked about a guaranteed rate, which is fantastic, and yes, that's a good rate. We're indicating that Fortis, it's based off of the Fortis regulated return. I'll start with my first question. Will it be identical to that rate? Is that in the language of the agreements? And will it stay that way in perpetuity for the life of the agreements?
Minister.
Well, the member will know in response to all of these that the agreements haven't been finalized. That's a preface for all the answer, but we want to give as clear an answer as possible, and that answer is yes.
Member.
Thank you, through the chair. The regulated return, am I assuming that that is something that is provided by the Utilities Commission?
Minister.
Well, if the member were advising them, you know that people have to know what they're getting when they sign on to an agreement, a project over 50 years. the Fortis rate of return is determined by the Utilities Commission. In this case, is being used because this is, and that's why we're passing the legislation, the first agreement. There hasn't been a previous agreement like this. This is used as essentially a proxy, the established rate of return for Fortis on its assets.
Member.
Through the chair, thank you to the minister. So I may have misunderstood a previous response then. Am I understanding that the rate of return that will be included in these agreements will be pegged identically to the Fortis rate, or it's used as a reference? Thank you.
Minister.
Pegged identically.
Member.
Thank you. That's great. I do appreciate that. And I'm assuming from the previous answer that we know that that is, again, the lifespan of the asset. What I believe that I had understood from one of the previous responses is that should maintenance activities occur on this line, that there are already mechanisms in these agreements that would be signed as part of Clause 1 that would be in place automatically to extend, or would a renegotiation of that agreement be required after the lifespan of the asset is expired?
Minister.
Thank you, Honourable Chair. The opportunity for reinvestment will be established in the agreement.
Member.
With all due respect, I'm not sure I understand that answer. Is it going to be automatically rolled over renewed, or would it require, and perhaps that's, I didn't ask correctly, would it be an automatically rollover renewal, or would it be required to be renegotiated? Thank you.
Minister.
So, honorable member, there are effectively 50 years of payments. After the 50 years, they continue to be co-owners of the asset, but there are no further payments. It's for 50 years, right? Continue to co-own the asset. The assets still exist, and electricity may be going through them. You know, I'll personally be 111, so it'll be good. And there would be a possibility for other reinvestments, and those are already will be anticipated in the agreement when it's signed. But essentially, the agreement for the payments is for 50 years.
Member.
Through the chair, thank you to the minister. Again, for the sake of clarity, what I believe that I just heard is that the agreement for payments ends after 50 years, but the ownership is in perpetuity. Is that correct?
Minister.
The co-ownership of the asset continues until we cease needing to use it effectively. So yes, the asset will continue to be co-owned, but the payments are for 50 years.
Member.
Thank you for that answer through the chair. Would the partnership, in the event that these assets do extend past the lifetime of 50 years, say it's 70 years, just as a number, I have no idea, is there a mechanism within the agreements that are signed as part of Clause 1 that would either set aside or have the ability to claw back reclamation costs of the assets from all partners? Demolition and reclamation costs.
Minister.
Thank you, Honourable Chair. Reclamation, if it were required at that point in the distant future, would be the responsibility of BC Hydro.
Member.
Thank you for the answer to the minister through the chair. Equity investment, as part of the agreements that would be signed under Clause 1, will there be a physical equity component that will exchange? I.e., I'm asking if participants will all be putting cash into the pot, for lack of a better description.
Minister.
Yes.
Member.
Thank you, Chair. Is there a standard formula, again, respecting the fact that these agreements are underway? How would BC Hydro ratepayers know that equivalent / fair, I'm trying to think of a better word, equivalent agreements are being signed with all nations?
So every nation in Phase 2 and in Phase 1 will sign effectively the same agreement. So that's what we're negotiating together. And so they'll have the same equity opportunity.
Member.
Thank you. To the minister through the chair, just to clarify, I heard the word opportunity. Will it be a requirement or will it be a voluntary investment opportunity by each nation? Thank you.
Minister.
Honourable Chair, thank you very much. Voluntary.
Member.
Thank you. So that, in my mind, brings the question of equitable treatment from one nation to the neighboring nation. If one nation chooses to put in X number of dollars, the next nation chooses not to, is there a concern that through the agreement signed under Clause 1 that it's going to make that inequity, or that perception of inequity between the neighboring nations, is that going to cause a problem with Phase 3?
Minister.
It's an excellent opportunity for all of the nations, and they all have an equal choice and an equal opportunity.
Member.
Thank you, Chair. Will there be an opportunity, or has there been, well, I will say will there be an opportunity, because again, respecting the fact that these agreements under Clause 1 are still under negotiation. Is there an opportunity, and we've already discussed the payment mechanism to which the asset will receive its rate. Actually, I think I might have just answered my own question, but I think I'm already halfway through it, so I'll answer it, or ask it anyway.
Go for it. Go for it.
In fact, I'm certain I answered it, but I'll throw it out there.
I think I've just made redundant.
Continue, member.
With respect to the, now I've lost my train of thought. With respect to the, actually I did lose my train of thought. I'm going to yield to one of my,
Yeah, take your time, member.
I shouldn't have laughed. It was a good one too.
Come back to it.
Okay, I will move on to the next one. In the agreements that will be signed under Clause 1, the government does define or does reference the word co-ownership. So in that context, and I know we've already talked about shared governance, that's clear, I understand that it's not shared, and I also understand that shared operational control has been established, that will not be the case. With respect to, and again, I think I may have answered my own question again, shared revenues, and I believe we did talk about that already. So I will move ahead again. What safeguards are in place to prevent further divestment of BC Hydro infrastructure, i.e. the infrastructure, and obviously this would be in relation to what the language included in those agreements would be under Clause 1. What safeguards are in place to prevent one party from divesting equity share or assets associated with that portion of the asset?
Minister.
I think I answered this question earlier, but the nations would be limited to selling either to BC Hydro or to other nations. That's the limit. And I asked that question earlier, which is fine. It's important to come at these things a couple of ways, and I understand the concern for the honourable member. So it's a good question, but we discussed that earlier, and that's the limitation on the ownership.
Member.
Through the chair to the minister, thank you for that, and that's the challenge of jumping around in your questions. My next one would be, were First Nations engaged in the development of this legislative framework? And secondly, were any of the nations consulted in drafting of this bill?
Minister.
Yes.
Member.
Thank you, Chair. Were all of them consulted, and how were they chosen?
Minister.
Yeah, well, we've listed off the First Nations that are involved in Phase 1 and 2 of the line, so that's the full list of nations along the line and who have the opportunity to take advantage of this equity opportunity. So how are they chosen? They were chosen in that respect and in that way. The consultation has been significant. Obviously, the legislation is required to proceed with NCTL, so it would have been assumed by the nations that the legislation was coming forward and that it would allow for this equity opportunity. It would make sense to negotiate an equity opportunity that was not permitted. There have been over 300 meetings between BC Hydro, the government, and the nations on this question so far. So yes, there's been lots of consultation.
Member.
Thank you for, through the chair, thank you to the minister for that answer. More specifically, were all of those nations afforded the opportunity to contribute to the drafting of Bill 31?
Minister.
No, it wasn't co-drafted in that sense. The intent of the legislation was to enable the agreements that that have been the subject of those hundreds of meetings and negotiations and thousands of hours. But the legislation was drafted by Legislative Council, But obviously, the nations involved, they're directly affected and substantially consulted in the matter.
Member.
Through the chair, thank you, Minister. That's, I accept the answer, for sure. Were the First Nations required to sign NDAs during the consulting or the drafting process of these agreements?
Minister.
Not with respect to the bill, not with respect to the legislation. There were not any NDAs, nor would there really have needed to be any NDAs. There are NDAs sometimes at the request of the nations for the negotiations. These are commercial negotiations, as you might imagine. So it's not that there's no NDAs in the detailed negotiations such as this. There are, of course, such NDAs to allow you to go forward as between the nations sometimes and with BC Hydro. But on the legislation, there were no NDAs signed.
Member.
Thank you to the Minister through the chair. Were there any NDAs signed with respect to execution or negotiation of the agreements that are subject to Clause 1 of this bill?
Minister.
Well, so the agreements haven't been executed. We're in the House talking about the legislation now. So for that part of the question, no, there are some NDAs in place at the request of the nations in the discussions and negotiations, but that's expected. It's in a negotiation now. So there's no executed agreements yet, obviously. We're we're enabling here such agreements to take place. So with that part of the question, it's no. There are NDAs involved in negotiations, as there would be in most commercial negotiations of this nature.
Thank you, Chair. To clarify, and I 100% agree that NDAs would be incredibly normal when it comes to commercial negotiations. Did BC Hydro, as the representative of the ratepayers of this province, require an NDA before negotiations were begun under any agreements that would be Clause 1?
Minister.
Well, the short answer is no. And just say that in a general sense between the nations, what I said to the member earlier, which is the need for equality of opportunity, requires transparency between the nations. The nations certainly understand. I don't speak for them here. They speak extremely well, as you can imagine the member knows for themselves. But the importance of transparency as between the nations is there. If you're going to have equality of opportunity, people legitimately would want to see that equality of opportunity. But there was no NDAs required in direct response to the question by the member.
Member.
Thank you, Chair. From a person that comes from a business background, that honestly is troubling. When we're talking about the kind of dollars that are likely to be involved here and not requiring an NDA, may I understand the rationale behind that?
Minister.
Let me say, I'm delighted to hear that the opposition become advocates for NDAs. But anyway, I think I'll just leave that. I'll just leave that aside. There's a moment in this context. I understand. I understand. So I'm just going to leave that there and to say I think in this process it's different than a commercial operation. Say the member had a business, right, and he had 4 investors, and they're 25%, and he was operating the business, right. Then there might be an NDA, and then there would be a need to inform business. In this case, the nations are people represented, and then more broadly, the people they represent, democratic organizations they represent. So the maximum of transparency is actually quite important in this process, right? And to ensure the democratic accountability for the nations, just as we're having democratic accountability here, democratic accountability for the nation. So in a general sense, you can tell in the response to the question, we've been pretty open about all the details of these agreements, really, as open as we can be. Equally, that was important in these discussions, that there be trust. You're building a transmission line not with one nation, right, which might be the case for, I don't know, an LNG project or something else, or a project that's sited in a particular place, but along a line. So the requirement for transparency is greater here, I think, for the nations who are participating. And then as they go back in their accountability structures and approve agreements, then for the people who are part of each of the nations. So if you're going back, regardless of which nation's involved, you're going back, you have to, and you want your community to approve an agreement, it's got to be fairly transparent. They're going to be asking questions, just as the honourable member in this place is asking questions about this legislation. So nations, First Nations would be structured differently perhaps than the commercial arrangements the member was thinking of, but in a general sense, this is an open process. BC Hydro's role in it and its management line, of course, is regulated by independent regulators, and our role in legislation by this House and passing this legislation which enables it. Equally, First Nations have similar accountabilities and transparencies required with their communities. So I think a more open process is actually understandable in this case. It's not affecting anybody's stock price in that sense, which is sometimes the reason why NDAs in such a negotiation would be required until an agreement was announced. This is a different process. The government announced in support of the process. BC Hydro did back in January 2024, engaged with First Nations in 2024, in the summer of 2024. So the relative transparency of all of this, given the important and central nature of the project, I think is actually quite normal and not, as the member suggests, at all disturbing. Quite the contrary. It's what nations and all of us might expect.
Member.
Thank you, Chair. I am going to yield in a moment because I find my mind is wandering a bit, and that might lead to my confusion on this point. We just discussed NDAs and the rationale of the need for openness. Earlier in the conversation, when it came to a discussion around the public being made aware of these agreements, which don't require an NDA, we were of the understanding, or I was left with the understanding that that was not reasonable to expect the public to have full access. And having executed many NDAs in the business world, I am aware that it is very easy to include your decision-making group within that NDA. That's not the intent to keep information secret, it's to keep it closed within a group. And earlier in the conversation, I understood that, and I will get to my question, I think it does require a bit of a preamble. I understood that that didn't make sense, or sorry, that the need for, I wouldn't want to call it secrecy, but the lack of transparency on commercial interests were a concern. I'm struggling to reconcile those two. Perhaps the minister could, through the chair, perhaps the minister could help me understand the difference. Thank you.
Minister.
Well, let me say this, when the agreements are finalized, they will be very public. We will be recognizing and celebrating them and in communities across the North, because I think it's a significant moment for the North. So there will be transparency. There may be some things, I said to the member earlier, that require commercial confidentiality, but the agreements and what we've achieved and what we're proceeding with, this will be a very public process. And the discussions in a broad sense with nations, what's involved, you know, there may be some desire, as between nations early on, or different nations, to maintain a certain degree of confidentiality as they engage themselves. But the purpose of creating equality of opportunity and the confidence required to do that, no special deals, right? That this is a deal across the board, differently managed with phase 2 nations and phase 1 nations in these two cases. My case for a more open process in this case, just in a general sense, and not having the discussions be secret and the rates of returns be secret and everything else be secret, is because of the nature of the discussions between First Nations governments, effectively, and BC Hydro and effectively the government of British Columbia. So that's the distinction I'd make between the two. The member need not worry. When agreements are signed, I will be present and delighted and celebrating those agreements. I can assure you I will not disappoint members of the opposition by remaining quiet at that exciting moment, I think, for our province.
Member.
Thank you, Chair. I accept the answer. Again, reconciling in my own mind the need for secrecy or lack thereof in this case, and yet when it comes to land agreements or other agreements, the government position appears to be different. And I would suggest in this case, my question would be, what safeguards would the ratepayers of BC Hydro have when there are potentially billion-dollar negotiations going on without NDAs signed?
Minister.
Agreements are approved by obviously BC Hydro senior management, by the board. In this case, there be some involvement by the province. And so whether there was an NDA during part of the negotiation or not would not change those obligations or responsibilities to the public. And ultimately, amongst other accountabilities, would be the discussions that we'll have, I'm sure, next spring in estimates, for example, and many others, the BC Hydro, for the Utilities Commission, and everyone else. So I think the public, which has very significant confidence in BC Hydro, according to independent public opinion surveys, well over 80%. Oddly enough, and this may seem incredible to the honourable member, even more popular than the government, which is below 80%, I'm told, in public approval. I think there's a lot of confidence in the senior management, in the board of BC Hydro, the work that they do in protecting the public interest, the interests of BC Hydro, and so on. So I'm not sure the existence of NDAs in and of itself is a protection. And you can make an argument. I mean, there are occasions, and the members cited, talked about this in commercial agreements and in government, where things have to be kept confidential. We've decided the cabinet discussions are confidential for lots of excellent reasons that have been established over now centuries, right? But I think our default position should always be, and especially in a very public process like this, to make sure that people have access to the information. And usually in a negotiation, what you're talking about isn't the final agreement, so you don't necessarily talk about everything, right? But what's being talked about is not a secret. People talk about that at all, whether it be, but you know, and we say this often in labor negotiations, and you've heard it recently in the labor negotiations that have taken place here in BC, that, you know, negotiations, bargaining's for the bargaining table, right? And so, but that doesn't stop people from talking about their views from time to time. And we've seen this in recent labor negotiations, and we see it in other negotiations. So I think ultimately BC Hydro does a good job for the ratepayers, established over time, the third lowest electricity rates in North America, a recognized rate of return, appreciated by the public, and boy, I appreciate them when there's windstorms and BC Hydro staff are out there working on them and doing an incredible job. So I think BC Hydro is highly respected in its role. Doesn't mean it never makes mistakes. I was the opposition BC Hydro critic for a time. My friends at BC Hydro may remember that time and the questions I asked. I'm reflective of reflective on that process in my current position. But I think the public has a lot of confidence in BC Hydro for good reason.
Member.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Would the minister be able to assure on the record that BC Hydro has, well, I'll rephrase. Are there other commercial interests that BC, or commercial agreements that BC Hydro has entered into without the use of an NDA?
Minister.
Well, I think the member, to a degree, answered his own questions earlier with respect to the negotiations that are the subject here of Section 1 and are being enabled effectively by Section 1. NDAs have not been required. We had all this discussion and the different views on NDAs in different circumstances. And I was just teasing the honourable member, but in fact, there are different views on those and the purpose of those NDAs. So I'm sure we'll be able to ask BC Hydro and can respond to the member in writing on the question of whether they sign commercial agreements. Typically, you make a commercial agreement on, say, a price for, I don't know, computers, something, and the price is often kept confidential for obvious reasons. The vendor has other customers, and there's reasons for that. So in this case, these agreements that are the subject are very public agreements, right? Well, going forward is a very public process. The negotiations aren't public. We don't have stadium seating for them, but with respect to these agreements, NDAs have not been required. Some have been signed in specific circumstances, but usually at the behest of other parties for good reasons as well. But generally, this is a fairly open process, and it makes sense. When you have to go back to your nation and talk about term sheets, you got to say what's in the term sheet. And as a government, that's to do just as I'm here in the legislature answering questions about the agreements as well.
Member.
Thank you. Through the chair, thank you to the minister for that. And the reasoning for my questioning is to try and establish if agreements being signed under Clause 1 are being treated differently in any way in structure than any other agreement that Hydro may have entered into. Thank you.
Minister.
Well, thank you. I mean, I think we understand the agreement's now unique because we're enabling this agreement under the law, right? So we know that this is unique in that respect. It's the first time we've engaged in a co-ownership agreement with First Nations on a project of this sort. So in that sense, it is unique and it is different, and that's why we're discussing it. If it was just another commercial agreement, it wouldn't be the subject of legislation. We require this legislation to proceed with the North Coast Transmission Line. I'll spare you another speech with the North Coast Transmission Line. We've had probably, the members have heard me quite enough, but that's the difference.
Recognizing the member from Salmon Arm, Shuswap.
Thank you, Honourable Chair. To the Minister through the Chair, I hate to be a little redundant here, but I just wanted to clarify a few things. In terms of the North Coast Limited Partnership, what will be the joint venture agreement between the First Nations? It's a limited company or three separate agreements, and it's leased back through the limited company? Maybe can you just clarify that a little bit better? I mean, if you don't.
Minister.
And just understanding, and I know the members has been engaged in the debate, so I don't want to be redundant, but understand that the agreements are still under negotiation. So we're enabling these agreements with this legislation. They're limited partnership agreements, and they'll have an agreement then, a separate contract for BC Hydro to construct the transmission line. Right? So that's the nature of the agreement.
Member.
Thank you, Minister. And to the Minister through the Chair. Will the First Nation partners be required to contribute any capital for their equity partnerships? And are the equity partnerships equal percentage?
Minister.
Yes, and equal opportunity across phase 1 and phase 2.
Member.
Thank you to the Minister. My question to the Minister through the Chair is, will the First Nation partners take the same risk as BC Hydro if the line is underused, given that BC Hydro might bill ratepayers anyways? In other words, the ratepayers are going to get paid. Ratepayers are going to be charged a certain percentage. If the line's underutilized or capacity, right, who is actually going to foot the bill?
Minister.
Yeah, I did answer this question earlier, and that's okay. We talked about the Fortis rate of return and the 9.65% return, and that's the answer to the question when you talk about getting paid as Fortis does on its capital investments. That was used as a reasonable basis because of Fortis regulated utility in BC as a good basis for this negotiations, and that's the return they will receive. Of course, you take off that return the cost of capital like you would any other investor. But this is a stable, good investment. It's why First Nations are interested, why they're, I think, overall enthusiastic about this project, other than the benefits for their regions and for business and for economic development.
Member.
Thank you to the Minister. To the Minister through the Chair. I understand that is based on Fortis's rate of return, and so basically it creates a yield. I also understand that that yield is actually created by the BC Utilities Commission. They actually look at the rates and they adjust the rates accordingly. And is that maybe the Minister could just clarify if that's correct? That's how Fortis's rates are determined. And also saying with that point is that if the BC Utility Commission is no longer going to be deciding how the rates are decided, that would be a regulator. Is that correct?
Minister.
Well, the reason the member that Fortis has used is that BC Hydro doesn't have a rate of return in the same way as Fortis does, and the member will understand the distinction between those two, I'm sure. So because Fortis does have a rate of return and has regulated their current rate of return on their investment, their assets and their capital investment is 9.65. That was seen as an effective proxy. It's not 9.65% yet in the agreements because the agreements aren't finalized, but once they are, that rate of return would be locked in.
The Minister.
Member, I'm recognizing you now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, jumping the gun. I thank the Minister for the last answer, and to the Minister through the Chair. I'll move on to another portion of Clause 1. With the co-owned facility and the limited partnerships, how will the protections of the Utilities Commission Act be preserved? It appears that the government is planning to exempt BC Hydro from BCUC regulations, specifically 38, utility must provide service; 41, no discontinuance without permission; and 52, restraint on disposition. Thank you.
Minister,
BC Hydro is still regulated by the BCUC. It's still the entity that operates the line, so the regulation continues. If the member is referring again, we had, I think, over a number of questions, discussion of the certificate of public convenience. If that's what the member is referring to, that's another thing on projects over $250 million. But BCUC remains the regulator of BC Hydro, which will be operating the line. And the ownership of the line will obviously be with the joint venture partnership, and BC Hydro will pay for that through lease payments. But with respect to the role of BCUC, it continues to have a role over BC Hydro. BC Hydro isn't receiving any exemption, and one of the reasons why we're clear about BC Hydro's rights here, and you see that in the section, it's also their responsibilities, which continue to be to the BC Utilities Commissioner as a regulated utility in BC.
member,
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the Minister. Given that it appears that BCUC has no oversight in this role in the project, who will ensure that the public interest is protected in these agreements? Now that you're moving away from BC Utilities Commission having oversight on this portion of the transmission lines, if I'm correct, who will have the public interest?
Minister,
BC Hydro operates the line. They're being regulated by the BC Utilities Commission. And so the public interest is maintained in that respect. And that was the answer to the previous question. That's the answer to this one.
recognizing the member from Peace River South.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to introduce an amendment to Clause 1.
We will take a short recess and provide copies to the committee. I call the committee back to order. We have an amendment to Clause 1. I recognize the member to speak to the amendment from Peace River South.
Thank you, Chair. This amendment would require the minister to disclose the ownership structure, including equity shares under the agreement, including not to exclude projected costs, revenues, and ratepayer exposure, along with the anticipated regional economic and employment benefits of the agreement. British Columbia's public authority, once they have entered into agreements, in most opinions, I would suggest, should have no problem letting the public know the details of those agreements, hence the amendment.
I find the amendment in order and recognize any other members who wish to speak to the amendment. And I recognize the minister.
Well, Honourable Speaker, there's no need for this step. It's unnecessary lawmaking. And we don't need to add things to the law that don't need to be in the law. We've just answered questions about the equity arrangement, the ownership structure in this House. I've made about an hour and 30 minutes of explanation in the Legislature as to why we're doing it, and which is a subject of a public debate. We're in favor of the transmission line, the opposition isn't, and that's a position that the opposition can defend and we can defend, for example. And so there's no need for this. These are agreements between First Nations and the provincial government. First Nations will be taking them to their people. There's no need to add a provision like this, and we will be fully accountable for both the agreements and the North Coast transmission line, its costs, and so on, through other structures. So there's no need to add redundant laws to legislation or to make laws more complex. And that's why I ask members not to accept this, but to accept what I've been doing, which is trying to, which we always try and do, I think, in our discussions, is be open about all those questions. Ownership structure, open. Rate of return, open. Straightforward discussion of what I think are the extraordinary benefits of the line, open. And that's what the member's asking for. We don't need to put it in the law. It's already happening.
Recognizing the member.
Thank you, Chair. With all due respect to the minister, and I do respect the minister, I would suggest that yes, and I do agree, he has absolutely done a very great job of being transparent. I suggest, maybe with tongue in cheek, that at some point he may not be the minister. I don't know how that would happen, but I think that this motion actually is important because, yes, the individual that's sitting in that chair is transparent and open. There's no guarantee in the future that that's going to be the case. And by having it written into the law that that transparency is required, I think is quite reasonable. Thank you.
Recognizing the minister.
Just to say that the ownership structure is of the partnership is understood. It's not going to change. Right? And as between the nations, there may be nations that don't participate, but that will be public as well, Honourable Speaker. And some of the issues are a little more, shall we say, unclear. They're subject to public debate. We believe that this unlikes the opportunities for mining. The Mining Association believes that, and others, but that will be a subject of public debate, which we're having right now. So the costs of the projects and the issues of rates are subject to BCUC review. In short, there's nothing here that either isn't happening or anyway, or that is required. So I guess adding laws that are redundant is not valuable. I'm sure if my colleague from Peace River South were the Minister of Energy, I'm sure that he would take the same approach I do. Well, I don't know. We'll see. We'll see, right? Or any other member of the House might be the Minister of Energy. I mean, I think really it's not the Minister of Energy is a person, but the Minister of Energy is an office, that you would expect that. And that's why we have the Utilities Commission Act and other requirements. This is a very public process, not just for the government, but for First Nations. And so adding additional requirements that aren't needed isn't something I favor. So I'm not, because of the way I'm answering the question, I'm not hostile to this, to what the members believes, that there should be transparency. I believe there should be transparency. I'm just saying it's not required. This section, this amendment to the Act isn't required, and that's why I'm asking people not to support this section, this amendment.
Recognizing the member.
Thank you, Chair. And I definitely am not trying to be argumentative in any way. I would simply say that the way I read this is that the requirement is to allow the public to view those agreements rather than those of us in the room having the discussions. And from that perspective, I would agree that, or I would suggest that it is reasonable. I'm not, again, not trying to be argumentative. Thank you.
Recognizing the minister.
Well, I wouldn't agree. I don't think the member said we should post the agreements. I don't think that's what the amendment says. It's a report based on the agreements with other things that probably wouldn't be in the agreement is what's there. But that may be a distinction with a difference. I don't think he's suggesting that the actual agreements needed to be posted on a public website, the commercial agreements. And so he's saying a report based on the agreements. And what I'm saying to him is that's going to happen. We don't need it to be put in the law.
Recognizing the leader of the third party.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I think I need, when the minister says that's going to happen, that will happen, I need to understand what the mechanism is that requires that. If you could please, if the BCUC is not involved, then I understand the need. I understand there's no point in unnecessary legislation, but if it's not written down somewhere else, then I'm inclined to support this unless there's another mechanism to require it.
Minister.
Well, with respect to 12.2A and the amendment, asked and answered, right? The answered, amongst other things, asked and answered. With respect to issues around revenues and ratepayers, BCUC regulates rates in this province, right? And so, and that issue will be a subject of an ongoing public debate and regular reporting, as it has to, in statements both by BC Hydro. In terms of the anticipated regional economic and employment benefits, that's really a subject of public debate. I strongly believe in the arguments I've made that the member has now heard me make maybe more times than he wishes to hear me make them. But that's really a subject of public debate. I'm sure the people who disagree with the approach or want us to build a small nuclear reactor or whatever may have a different view. And I've made those comparisons clearly, but I've made the case for the regional economic and employment benefits of the agreement. That's why we're proceeding. That's why we started to proceed in 2023. So all of this information, the case for it, has been made by BC Hydro, the government, the Premier, myself, and by a number of the First Nations, and the Mining Association, and many, and those who are supporters of clean electricity in our province. On the other issues are already dealt with elsewhere. So specifically, that's where they're dealt with elsewhere, and why I think the amendment, well-intentioned, I would absolutely concede, is not necessary, and why I won't be supporting the amendment.
Recognizing the leader of the third party.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Under A, the ownership structure, including any equity shares, I understand the minister's answered that to the best of his ability, but I thought, correct me if I'm wrong, I thought I also heard that negotiation or agreement wouldn't be put into place until this law is passed. So the minister's saying that the general ownership structure won't change, and that there's no specifics that would come out after this moment, after the answer that was given earlier in this committee?
Minister.
So the ownership structure of the joint partnership is 50-50. That won't change. What may change, but this is not something that, this will be something that would be announced at the time of the agreements by the nations themselves, is if, say, a First Nation chose not to participate in this exceptional equity opportunity, obviously that would be public. at that time. And so, but in terms of the ownership structure and the equity participation of First Nations in the government, that's established, and it's sort of asked and answered in this discussion. And that's why to put it in the law, let's say, and this may be just as a matter of administrative efficiency, is unnecessary. And so, this is a very public process, and we publicly laid out the structure of the agreement already. So I'm just saying adding it in to the law regarding the legislation is not necessary, and that's why I'm opposing it, not because I want to keep the information secret. I just told you the information.
Recognizing the member from Salmon Arm, Shuswap.
Thank you, Honorable Chair. To the Minister, I see no problem with more transparency and taking away any possibility of changes happening down the road that ratepayers would not be aware of. By the Minister's own admission here, he said that that is a good thing. Transparency is a good thing. So, and like my colleague said earlier, there's no guarantee that down the road, under a different ministry, under a different government, that things might change, right? And I think that having more transparency, having more accountability, which is in this amendment, is a good thing. We covered the equity shares of the agreements, and as the Minister explained, it's 50-50 currently, and I assume they're never going to change, right? At least that's what we've been told. But the projected costs, revenues, and ratepayer exposure may. And so from that aspect, I believe that, you know, having this amendment in there protects the ratepayers. And especially if we actually move away from having a BC Utility Commission overseeing rates. Thank you.
Minister.
The BC Utilities Commission will continue to oversee rates.
Okay. On the amendment, the question is the amendment to Clause 1. Shall the amendment pass? Nay. A division has been called. Before putting in the question, I remind all members that only members of the Section A or their duly appointed substitutes are authorized to vote. The question, the amendment to Clause 1, moved by the member of Peace River. Those in favor, please rise or otherwise indicate. Those voting nay, please rise or otherwise indicate. You may be seated.
Those voting aye, Cooner, Mock, Williams, Valeriot, 4. Those voting nay, Dix, Shaw, Anderson, Bailey, Blatherwick, 5.
The motion is defeated on Clause 1. Leader of the third party. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just going to, actually, I'll pause while staff come back in, and I need to. You can take it on.
Just one moment. We'll,
Yes, no, yes.
leader of the third party, just wait for the commotion here. People are talking, so just take your seat. Recognizing the leader of the third party.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Since we've just voted on an amendment that talks about benefits to British Columbians, I ask a little bit about both provincial and municipal tax revenues. Actually, no, sorry. Let me gather my thoughts. That's the LNG section of this, which we will get to in a little bit. That'll be later. I just want to talk about overall electrical capacity. So, BC Hydro has estimated about 3,700 megawatts of power needed to be added to the grid by 2029 to avoid an electricity deficit. Even with new electricity projects in development, province could still experience an electricity crunch as early as 2026 if emissions-intensive industries like mining and LNG are electrified. Given this context, what analysis is being done to determine what the best use of electricity in BC, beyond the 3 industries specified in this new, what analysis is being done beyond these 3 industries that are targeted by this legislation?
Minister.
Thank you. Just to the member, we're on Section 1, which is the section that deals with First Nations co-ownership of the North Coast Transmission Line. I'm not going to not answer his question, but I think there will be quite a bit of opportunity on Section 2. I'm guessing, I'm predicting. I could be wrong later on. I just say, in a general sense, what he knows, and which is that BC Hydro, I answered this earlier, over a period of 20 years has had relatively flat growth. This is because of some achievements in conservation. LED lighting has played a more significant role than people would think in the reduction of residential electricity costs, commercial electricity costs, and others. But we've also seen a decline in large industrial loads by subsectors, particularly forestry. What we're seeing now is a change in that. First, we're seeing what we've seen over the last number of years, which is an unprecedented increase in population, which has effects on all elements of BC life, but does on energy as well. So there's increasing demand for electricity. Secondly, as a province, we believe strongly believe in our clean energy agenda and are pursuing repeated calls for power. And as I said in my answer, presents to the member for Peace River South, which demonstrates a substantive response to those issues. Thirdly, BC Hydro in 8 of the last 15 years has had exported more power out of the province than it's imported. And in 7, it's imported more than it's exported. We typically import more in drought years. But what is universally true is that because of the outstanding nature of the legacy clean energy system we have and the extraordinary work of BC Hydro, we consistently make the power we sell in the United States and in Alberta and other places is worth dramatically more than the power we buy. So we're doing extremely well. Further, our electricity rates, as the member will know, are, say, 60% lower in Vancouver than in Edmonton, and that's a tribute to public ownership of the resource, which is an important consideration, a continuing consideration. Who are our only competitors? The other publicly owned systems, Manitoba and Quebec. And we have an obligation as we meet out this new energy demand. We see it as mining, right? It's significant. There is demand in LNG, although I wouldn't expect necessarily incremental projects, the ones under construction, being in place in the timeframe the member suggests, which is there, and we just acknowledge it. Those projects such as the Port of Prince Rupert, some forestry projects, the continuing increase in demand, and then the areas that were identified in the legislation, which I won't talk about now, but we'll get to when we get to Section 2.
Recognizing the leader of the third party.
Thank you, and I take the minister's point that we can get to some of these broader questions in Section 2, and so I will actually restrict my questions to the North Coast Transmission Line. A couple of things that suggest that that wasn't on the books for a long period, and that I would like to understand. I understand that BC Hydro's long-term planning documents as recently as 2023 didn't mention the North Coast Transmission Line. And the 2021 IRP only has a few comments associated with transmission to the South Coast. 2023 update doesn't add anything on the North Coast. Was the new demand in the Northwest a surprise? And did the impetus for pushing this come from BC Hydro or from the government?
Minister.
BC Hydro's job is, in part, is to serve its customers, residential, commercial, and industrial. It's part of its job, and I think we all agree on this. It's a huge advantage for BC is to drive development in our province and jobs and opportunity with clean electricity that makes a difference, and that's a significant part of it. With respect to the Northwest, the opportunities in critical minerals, which the member himself has spoken of in the legislature, which are significant, and their importance has become clearer in recent years, as has the fact that the Northwest is limited by the current transmission structure. So as it was the case with increasing population that we built the interior lower mainland line, we're looking at building the North Coast Transmission Line. In 2023, BC Hydro undertook, and I think the original announcement may have been made by the former Minister of Health, but also by the then BC Hydro President Chris O'Reilly, was we saw this growing development in the Northwest of opportunity in the Northwest and the need to serve and the need to meet the government requirement for electrification, right, in that region. And so we went out and contacted potential industrial and other customers in the region to say, well, what will the demand be? And we got, as the member knows, because it's been detailed in the background documents that have been shared with them, a very significant response in 2023. And as a result of that, BC Hydro started to work on the North Coast Transmission Line, which is absolutely necessary if we're going to take advantage, for example, of opportunities in the Port of Prince Rupert, opportunities in mining, other opportunities, and the need for potentially increasing population growth in the Northwest, and of course, the need as far as the government was concerned, as my government policy was concerned, the need to support LNG as well. That's, I want to lay it all out there for the member. And the need to, under the current policy, to electrify in order to deal with issues of emissions, as well as give us a product that I think would be highly regarded around the world. BC Hydro did the review, saw the demand. And it was also decided, I'd say between BC Hydro and the government, that the best way to consider a North Coast transmission line would be to involve First Nations. And that's what we started to do as of the summer of 2023. And in January 2024, BC Hydro put out its 10-year capital plan. Premier announced that at the Natural Resources Conference in January of 2024. And we've proceeded on that since then. Term sheets were signed in 2025 and so on. So it is a response to the obvious and historic, I think, opportunity for people in the Northwest, a region which, by the way, overall has suffered, I think, I won't want to make it comparative, a great deal from the relative decline in forest jobs in the province over 20 years, which is significant. Overall, employment and income, this is a region that requires investment and should not be limited in that investment by a lack of access to electricity in a province where a lot of that electricity is produced in the north, most especially in the Peace Country, but also, of course, in the southeast and the Columbia. So we don't build projects like Site C or the 10 renewable energy projects or the ones that will come in the coming call for power. We don't build them just for Metro Vancouver or Vancouver Island. We build them for the whole province, and ensuring that access is available and this opportunity is available, especially in the Northwest, is there. I'd say finally, the government's worked hard in our work with the Taltan on mining issues in the Northwest. I think it's historic work, and it's going to be part of opening up an historic opportunity. So I think all of that is involved, I'd say to the member, and that's a little bit of the history of how we came here. So yes, it wasn't announced in 2021. That process was 2023. It identified very significant demand well above that which will be served by the North Coast transmission line, but you assume some projects may or may not happen. And then the government proceeded, and we're proceeding with First Nations, which is the subject, bringing us back of Section 1.
Leader of the third party.
Thank you. So another late addition seems to be Phase 3 of this transmission line. During BC Hydro's virtual open house at the end of June, the map showed Phase 1 and Phase 2. Phase 3 wasn't listed, and I see it's sort of a dashed line with an arrow potentially heading to the Yukon border. Can the minister tell us when Phase 3 was formalized?
Minister.
Well, we're starting, obviously, you're starting a transmission line. You start with Phase 1 and Phase 2. So those are the things we're working on, those agreements on now. We're starting to work on Phase 3 now. But I would say to be able to bring that power to, especially to support the mining opportunities in the Northwest, is significant. I also say, and this has been raised in public debate recently, there is no project to the Yukon without the North Coast transmission line. Our vision of this project is to go essentially from Prince George to Terrace to Bob Quinn Lake, where I have never been, but I'd like to go. And that's the vision of the project. And then projects that are connecting to that would pay for their interconnection to the main line. But if you're going to get to the Yukon, you get to Bob Quinn Lake, right? And so that would be another project that probably wouldn't be a BC Hydro project, although we'd be very much involved in the management of that project. We'd have to see. We have an agreement with the Yukon government, and there would be lots of other people involved in that. But that would be, for them, a huge nation-building opportunity. And while it's not entirely the responsibility of us or BC Hydro to satisfy that, we are interested in talking and encouraging them. And obviously, the Prime Minister, Mr. Carney, has expressed significant interest in that project as well. But you have to start, and we're starting in Prince George, we're going to Terrace, and then we're going through Phase 3. And obviously, the Phase 3 discussions with nations and others will happen as we're building Phase 1 and 2.
Leader of the third party.
Thank you. Apologies if this has been canvassed. I had to be out of the room for a few minutes. On the subject of who will pay for this, I'd like to try and understand Tariff Supplement 6 and how it will apply, and whether customers, some of these industrial customers will pay for the cost of line tap or system reinforcements. So it may not be a simple question, but will customers using the North Coast transmission line pay these costs as mandated by Tariff Supplement 6? And if not, why not?
Minister.
Well, now we're talking about part of Tariff Supplement 6, because there's a broader review. Tariff Supplement 6 contains a relative complexity, and I'll do my best not to be complex here. It was the case that projects that were higher than 150 megawatts were treated differently in the way that costs were assigned by BC Hydro. I'm simplifying it, but just so remember, just for people to understand. This was an artificial level put in place, I believe, by the Social Credit Government. It may have been Energy Minister Jack Davis or Energy Minister Jack Weisgerber. I don't know. I'm reminded Peace River South is always in my heart. And because he was the MLA for Peace River South. It was put in place for specific reasons around, I think, a specific project on Vancouver Island and some concerns that people had around that project. It's never been used, right? So it's essentially discriminates against projects that are the largest job-creating projects, as opposed to, so if you're 170, you're treated differently than if you're 130. And in our view, it would have meant that the projects in question would not go ahead, because essentially the first project that's signed on would be responsible for very significant costs on the line, and that doesn't make sense. And so that's the element of Tariff Supplement 6 that's involved in the legislation, and when we refer to that. And even though it's not obviously a subject of this section, which deals with First Nations co-ownership, we've developed a very open process of discussion, but this is about First Nations co-ownership. But if the member would like further briefings on the question of Tariff Supplement 6, which will be, I think, is also going to be soon the subject of BCU review, not for these portions, but for others, then we'd be happy to provide that.
Leader of the third party.
Thank you. I'm concerned that the government's obscuring the outsized role of the LNG lobby in driving this transmission line. I understand the co-ownership as a result of trying to drive this forward. And it is obviously mixed in with critical minerals and port expansion. But it's a very direct question. Is Bill 31 a condition of LNG Canada investors making a final investment decision on phase 2, or Silisum's final investment decision?
Minister.
Well, I think the member's incorrect. Cedar LNG is going forward with existing facilities, the existing line. LNG Canada 1, of course, is not. Well, it uses electricity for some of its functions. It's not an electrified line, nor will LNG Canada 2. So if you look at the list of projects that would be potentially affected by that line, there's only one, and this is not the result of an LNG lobby. And it is, in part, though, I would say, part of our commitment to electrification. And electrification is in this whole region. And this is part of the debate we had at second reading, which, again, I won't repeat. But the opposition has argued either for nuclear reactors in the region, which is, I won't repeat what I said, I'll just refer to my closing speech on that question. Others have argued that they should all be gas-fired. That's not the view of the government. Our clean electricity advantage should be there for mining and ports and LNG and everything else to reduce emissions, but also because it's cost of energy. And just repeat, the comparative price of the average levelized price of our call for power is $74 against more than $300 for a small nuclear reactor in the region, just to make that comparison. Or Site C, which is about $89 to $96 in comparison to more than $300. So clean electricity is a good deal for ratepayers. It's a good deal for the public, and it's why we're supporting it. But it also is a fundamental way to address climate change. If we have increased demands for electricity, then the only way to do that and not negatively affect climate change is to build out clean electricity, and that is what the North Coast Transmission Line helps to do. You can't just have wind power projects or dams. You got to deliver the electricity where it's needed, and then you do that through transmission lines. So I just disagree with that characterization, and I think the member was putting forward as a question. I just disagree with it. If you look at the list of projects, really you're talking about, and it has not received an FID yet, Solicums, right? It's received an environmental assessment certificate, but it hasn't come forward with its FID as of yet. So that would be the one project on the list of projects that we're talking about that would be LNG. So I think the answer to the question is no.
Leader of the third party.
I appreciate the long answer. I'm going to ask, I guess, very much more specific. Is the Silicim's FID dependent on the North Coast Transmission Line being built and this bill passing?
Minister.
Well, the Silicim's LNG is a commercial decision that they're making. We have as a subject of policy that from now on that LNG plants have to be electrified. So in that sense, this is helpful to that project, but also helpful on issues of climate change, helpful on broader issues, right? The electrification of this line as opposed to the delivery of energy and other means is a net positive for that project. But I suspect the FID, and the member and I have discussed this publicly and privately before, will depend on other factors, including the international market and other cost factors that Silicim is doing. I think that the Nisga'a First Nation is doing an outstanding job leading that project, but they'll be making their decisions, I'm sure, based on a wide number of factors.
Shall Clause 1 pass? Aye. Member from Priest River South.
Thank you, Chair. I know that we did canvass this when I was up previously, but I find myself confused with a statement that was made during another explanation, and I really need to understand this in my mind. So, question to the minister through the chair: is it a 50-50 partnership that is being considered under the agreements in Clause 1, regardless of the amount of equity invested? So, i.e., if zero equity is invested, is there still a 50% share that is provided?
Minister.
I think what the member is getting at is if, say, some nations choose not to participate, what will the options? And that is being negotiated. There's two options in that respect. Hydro could take a greater percentage of the shares, or there may be some offering of those shares to other nations. So one of those two things would happen. It's my expectation, though, that nations will participate, and it'll be 50-50. But that would be the circumstance if for example, people decided not to participate, not to invest, and they obviously would miss out on the opportunity, but also that would be an opportunity for others to take up that share in what's, after all, an excellent investment.
Member from Peace River South.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the Minister. So perhaps a hypothetical, client A, potential partner A, puts in, pick a number, 10, whatever, 10 joules. Partner B puts in 30 joules, partner C puts in the maximum 50. Are the proportion of the shares allotted as per the amount of equity that is put in, or what is the formula that's being considered? Is that clear? Thank you.
Minister.
Yeah, you don't get offered a portion of a unit of equity. Everyone's being offered an equitable deal or an equal deal.
Member from Peace River South.
Thank you to the Minister. I remain confused. So if Group A puts in 10 units, and the maximum is 50, so I guess what I'm getting at, or what I'll try to make this less confusing. The equity component that's being offered to each of the First Nations, is it directly proportional to the amount of equity that they are investing, or is everyone given the same proportion of share regardless of the equity that they invest?
Minister.
That was pretty straightforward. They're all being offered the same equity.
Member from Prince River South.
Okay, so if a nation invests 0, they're still offered 50% share, or 50, their portion of the equity. I'm not sure why, I'm struggling to explain this. So every nation is getting the same proportion of the shares, regardless of whether they invest equity or not? No? Okay.
Minister.
No, you have to invest to participate. I was going to use another expression, and I found those words, but you have to invest. You're offered the same opportunity. There's no requirement that people take it up, but it's, I think, an excellent long-term arrangement that I expect nations will take up, but we're still in discussions, and so we'll see. But I think that you definitely have to invest. There's no, everybody are investors in the joint venture partners.
Member from Peace River South.
Thank you to the Minister for the clarification. That was my original understanding, and one of the responses challenged that in my mind. So thank you for that, and I apologize that it took me that long to make that clear. With respect to the return, and I know we did spend a fair amount of time on establishing the 9.65%. I've since been informed that that rate that we're using to peg the return to, and of course that was the Fortis rate, there is a 50% debt utilization that goes into that component. Is there any, with the agreements that are being negotiated under Clause 1, is there any requirement for debt, or is there any plan for debt to be involved in this project, or will debt have any influence over the rate of return? Thank you.
Minister?
So BC Hydro, as members know, we had this discussion, I think, at second reading, Member Shuswap, and operates on an 80-20 debt equity ratio, which will apply to this project for both sides of the project, for the First Nation side and for BC Hydros.
Member from Peace River South?
Thank you for that answer, Minister. So if the 80-20, which I understand, will the agreements signed as part of Clause 1, will they assign the proportion, that 20% proportion of the debt to the partner nation?
Minister?
So it's 20/80, so effectively the equity investment is 10/10, makes 20. And then BC Hydro will manage the debt for both sides, because for good reasons, it's in a good position to manage the debt at the lowest cost. And so that's the way the program will work. So the equity investments are there, and then the rest is debt, which is, like with all projects from Site C to all the others, is managed by BC Hydro.
Member from Prince, or sorry, my apologies, Peace River South.
Thank you, Chair. Another hypothetical for any agreement that may be signed under Clause 1, should, in the unlikely eventuality that the line is not successful or underutilized, would the nation partner remain responsible for that 20% debt if the partnership were, for whatever reason, to dissolve? Or does that revert back to Hydro?
Minister?
So this is an asset that's put in place, and they get a return on the asset, as we discussed earlier. So in this case, it's 20% equity, 80% debt. Just, because I think sometimes we flip around, sometimes maybe I flip around, so just to be clear what that is. But this asset is going to be successful in any event, but the asset's put in place, and then the joint venture partners receive the payments for that asset and the return for that asset, which is pegged, as we discussed earlier, at 9.65%.
Member from Peace River South.
Okay, thank you for that answer. I do believe that I'm understanding better. In that vein of thought process, how, when this offer is being made to the partners, when the financial offer is written down and it's presented, there's clearly has to be a value there that needs to be established as far as what the amount that's being asked for to be invested. How is that amount assessed? Is that something that Hydro comes up with? Is there a third-party assessor? Is there again, thinking from the vein that I might be the hypothetical that I was advising a nation whether to invest or not, how would we establish the fair market value of what they're being asked to invest in?
Minister?
Yeah, thank you, Honorable Chair. And it's the capital cost of the line by Class 3 estimate, the time that definitive agreements are put in place. It's then independently reviewed, which parties who are investing that kind of money would want. And then their benefit is 9.65% on their investment, obviously minus the cost of borrowing for profit. And remember, we'll understand that. But that's how that's dealt with, and that's how it will be dealt with. Class 3 estimate, time definitive agreement, independently reviewed. And the 965 applies to the capital investment at that time.
Member from Prince River South.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the answer. That makes sense. With respect to debt financing, the partner nations that would be asked to invest, are there any restrictions on the proportion of cash versus, can they borrow 100% of the investment? Or are there any restrictions on it? And how is that controlled?
Minister.
Yeah, there are really no limitations now. I mean, they have to provide their equity. How they get that is, as would be with anyone else, their business, right? And how they get that, should they borrow their equity, would be a discussion between them and the financial institution, wherever they're borrowing from. But there are no restrictions in the way I think that the member was suggesting.
Member from Peace River South.
Thank you for the answer, Minister. So to be clear in my mind, 100% debt, 100% debt financing would be allowed under the agreements that would be signed from Clause 1.
Minister.
Thank you very much, Honourable Chair. There's an equity share and there's a debt share. And like anyone else who's participating in that, how they provide their equity share, it will be subject to their financial arrangements, right? But it's not debt. They're providing equity as BC Hydro is based on every other BC Hydro project. How they provide that equity is their business.
Member from Seminar Shuswap.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. To the Minister, through the Chair, in subsection 2A, it states that a limited partnership through which the authority of a First Nation holds ownership interests in part of one of the following as specified in the agreement. 1, Phase 1 of the project. 2, Phase 2 of the project. 3, Phase 3 of the project. Can the Minister clarify whether a nation can only be a partner in one phase of the project?
Minister.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Honourable Chair. And the participation in each phase of the line depends entirely on geography. So just to be clear, for all the participating nations in Part 1, which is Prince George Fraser Lake, that would obviously be the only part that they would participate in. Part 2 and Part 3, there may be some overlap between Part 2 and Part 3 as one turns the corner north, depending on the nation. That's yet to be determined, so that's possible. But in any event, it's entirely dependent on geography. So the Part 1 nations would not be purchasing into Part 3, for example.
Member from Seminar Shuswap.
Thank you to the Minister, and thank you, Chair. To the Minister, through the Chair, in subsection 2C, can the Minister clarify what potential asset that can be transferred or assigned through an order in council might be?
Minister.
Yeah, Hydro may construct the line on behalf of the partnership, then turn it over to the partnership. That's what it referred to.
Member from Seminar Shuswap.
Thank you to the minister. To the minister through the chair. Could that same asset at a later date be transferred back to BC Hydro through an order in council?
Minister.
BC Hydro doesn't breach its agreements.
Member from Seminar Shuswap.
Thank you, Minister. And thank you, Chair. To the minister through the chair. Would a First Nation be able to transfer the asset to another First Nation or a non-First Nation private entity?
Minister.
We've answered this question a couple of times, but the First Nation would have two options in terms of that. One, to another participant in the process. That is possible. Another part of the partnership, or alternatively to BC Hydro.
Member from Seminar Shuswap.
Thank you, Speaker, and thank you, Minister. Can the minister clarify whether subsection 3 retroactively overrides any other legislation specifically for the North Coast transmission line? Or will this also affect current and future projects?
Minister.
Yeah, there was some discussion, I think, by the member for Peace River South of this question at second reading. Happy to respond. BC Hydro and First Nations are in ongoing negotiations. We've established that once an agreement has been reached, it will then be brought to Cabinet to designate. Cabinet cannot designate an agreement in real time, obviously. The retroactivity language mirrors existing languages is currently in the Hydropower and Power Authority Act that allows Cabinet to designate BC Hydro agreements for support services. Now, we're not talking about open-ended authority here in any way. Cabinet can only designate agreements that relate to specific parameters related to the NCTL project itself. Examples include ownership through limited partnerships, construction and operation of the NCTL transmission line, asset transfer, service provision, and payments between BC Hydro and the partnership, all related to NCTL. These are clearly defined in the legislation to ensure transparency and accountability.
Member from Seminar Shuswap.
Thank you, Speaker, and thank you, Minister, for clarifying. Going back to the BC Utilities Commission, I understand they'll have limited or no oversight in this project once it goes to a regulator. That being said, who is going to ensure that the public interest is protected in these agreements?
Minister.
The BC Utilities Commission, and that's the reason this has been laid out in this way, continues to have its authority over BC Hydro, which is building and operating the transmission line. So the purpose of this agreement is not to in some way evade BC Utilities Commission oversight, and it does not.
Shall Clause 1 pass? Aye. Member from Peace River South.
Thank you, Chair. With respect to, and I do appreciate the Minister's previous answer around the retroactive restatement around the retroactivity clause. I don't know that this has actually been established in any of the conversations that we've had to date, though. What agreements are being or are potentially subject to this retroactive clause that's included in the bill? Which ones will be changed?
Minister.
The designated agreements referred to in the section of the Act that only relate to NCTL.
Member from Peace River South.
Is there any language that would prevent? Actually, I'll accept that. I would like to introduce an amendment, please.
Okay.
Read.
Member from Peace River South, yep, read your amendment.
Read the amendment or read the statement? Okay. This amendment would restrict co-ownership of North Coast facilities. I know that we have
Oh,
discussed
my
it.
apologies, Mark. You just have to move your amendment.
Okay.
So moved.
Move.
Yeah.
Okay.
Say I move my
I'd like to
amendment.
move my amendment, may I move amendments to Clause 1 of Bill 31?
Yes, go ahead, member.
This amendment would restrict co-ownership of North Coast facilities, and I do respect that that has been discussed more than once. But again, I think it's valid to put that into legislation for the simple fact that it would ensure that that ownership would stay as intended. Any First Nation who enters into agreement with BC Hydro for co-ownership cannot sell their ownership off to a third-party organization. They can only sell their ownership back to the authority for the same amount that they paid for it to become a co-owner.
Thank you, member. We will take a short 5-minute recess while we get copies made for everyone. committee back to order. Okay. We have an amendment in front of us. Minister, I will look to the minister.
Just speak briefly in response to the amendment. I believe the Lieutenant Governor is coming soon, so we'll be adjourning, if that's all right with members. After I give a little bit of my response, we hear my response. I think just in general, I think these provisions are subject to the agreements themselves, and that they should be. That when you're going into an agreement, these are the questions you negotiate. Our agreements are limited, in other words, to the participation of those along the lines. And I just note that the value of the agreement does depreciate over time. So the effect of the beginning evaluation isn't as important. It wouldn't have any effect, really, I think, what's happening here. So I'm not in support of the amendment. I understand what the member is doing, is he's expressing the concern, and this is why it's in the agreement, why I've been explicit about what's in the agreement, that's the potential for a First Nation member of the limited partnership to sell outside of the First Nation, and he's trying to assure that that doesn't happen here. So are we. We believe they should be subject to the actual agreements with First Nations as they would be in a commercial thing, and that there are other small problems with the amendment, so we don't support the amendment. But that said, we understand the intent of it. And with that, Honourable Chair, I move that the committee rise and report progress and ask leave to sit again.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? So ordered. So the committee stands adjourned until our next sitting.